Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a campaign guide for the Empire. Now that Creative Assembly has allowed a far larger portion of the player base to be able to play Immortal Empires by just owning either Warhammer 1 or Warhammer 2. You no longer need to own Warhammer 3, and there's also all kinds of discussions on access with regards to DLCs, but that's its own subject matter. Either way, at the moment, we have the following campaigns available for the Empire. We have Karl Franz, we have Gelt, we have Elspeth. You can, of course, play Marcus Wolfhard or Volkmar, but at the moment, these campaigns are outdated. Maybe that will change at some point in the future, but for a moment, I would not recommend those two campaigns. Now, between Elspeth, Gelt, and Karl, Elspeth focuses on two things: gunnery units and magic. So she's got really powerful and unique gunnery units through her campaign mechanics. She's kind of like the Claw of the Empire. But she also has a good amount of magic potential in her campaign. Lots of mages she can get, lots of winds of magic she can use as well. Gelt is focused purely on magic. So he has apocalypse spells, he has a bunch of faction benefits through the colleges of magic. But his army is not necessarily that special, although he can unlock Electrocount State Troopers fairly quickly in his campaign through money, and he can literally print money every couple of turns. And then we have Karl Franz. He doesn't have unique units or a focus on magic, but he does have a significant focus on building an empire properly. So he can confederate factions with certainty through his Emperor of the Empire mechanic. He starts with just Electrocount Confederation available to him. Then he can confederate any Imperial faction across the map as long as he has vision with him. He gets growth benefits, he gets State Troopers benefits, he gets all kinds of benefits. My recommendation if you're looking to play the Empire right now is to play Karl Franz. Gelt and Elspeth are more specialized campaigns, though I would also recommend people to buy the Thrones of Decay DLC for the Empire because the units, Lord, Master Engineer, and Hero Engineers are very useful. But you don't need to. Even if you have access to none of the DLCs, Karl Franz is still going to be a really solid campaign. So when you're starting an Imperial campaign, here are some of the things you should know from the very beginning. One of the things you should prioritize is growth. So that means getting a bunch of fields in settlements that you're getting. It might hurt you in terms of your unit production and hero production, but getting that growth will help you out a lot because the Empire has a bunch of heroes it can use, has a bunch of hero capacity, but that you at least require tier 3 to unlock a good amount of really powerful units and heroes to use in your campaign. So prioritizing growth at the beginning of campaigns will help you out a lot. That's one of the first things, and it's kind of a universal lesson I would share with everyone that focusing on growth very early on in a campaign always pays off later on. On top of that, we got to talk about research. With the Empire, with the research tree, what you should focus on is the Imperial colleges. Not fully, but to some degree or another, focusing on Imperial colleges will be very useful. Because what Imperial colleges give you is not manners, but rather Clergy of Sigmar, Engineers Guild, Intelligence Sharing, and Imperial University. The thing I like to focus on is Clergy of Sigmar or Engineers Guild. Sometimes you want to get those warrior priests, other times you want to get those engineers. Engineers provide you extra campaign movement range so you can move around the campaign map faster. That's useful in certain circumstances. Whereas Clergy of Sigmar gives you casualty replenishment. Depends on the campaign, depends on what you're dealing with, and honestly depends on how many casualties you're taking in battle, be it for auto-resolve or manual battles. Usually, I personally prefer to focus on the Clergy of Sigmar and then Engineers Guild, and then start getting things like grain silos into production for construction costs, assembly line, and ultimately into Imperial architects, if I care about that. But you may not necessarily care about that because there is a way you can bypass the construction time of settlements. See, there is a trait that is available both on Lords and heroes. And you can use the load save character system for this. It's called the Noble trait. The Noble trait reduces construction time for all buildings in a region. It's not a province, but in a region reduces construction time by 25%. That means once you have 4 of them, you can basically construct buildings instantly. It is money required to be spent in order to get those lords in particular, but keep in mind it is also available on heroes, so warrior priests can do it, for instance. But yes, you can have it on multiple heroes, multiple lords, and it can and will stack up. So for instance, over here, I'm just using the load save character system. If you're playing Karl Franz, you do want to recruit a lord and Helmgart, so that way you can recruit 2 lords on turn 1, so that on turn 2 you can take Ubersreich. Like, you will take Grunberg, then you can force march to Ubersreich, and you're also baiting this army to move into Ubersreich so you can eliminate it faster. That's one of the core principles of playing a campaign, using the AI against itself when you are playing against them. And also, a good way of getting money early on is going around and declaring wars on various factions. Be careful about this, like you don't want to declare war, say, on Vlad or the Changeling, but couple of things like, say, the Skullcrackers, which Lewin will destroy very quickly in a campaign, or the Bloody Spears, depending on the vision you have, can be very useful. Be mindful how far you're going with this, because there are absolutely drawbacks when you're doing this. But for instance, you can declare war on Artois if you're playing Karl Franz, and then turn 2, you can get a peace agreement, because with Artois, for instance, Kamler will take this settlement, and then that will just leave Castle Artois. They'll be willing to get a peace agreement with you and leave you alone. Now, in terms of unit recruitment, there's a whole video I've done on the subject of what units you should recruit, but early on in a campaign, you want a combination of spearmen with shields on tier 1, and then likely pistoliers. Pistoliers, spearmen with shields, then you go up with outriders, crossbowmen, captains, witch hunters, etc. Different decisions, depends on what DLC you own and what you don't own, but those are some of the paths available to you in terms of unit recruitment. What I would also mention is with regards to Imperial authority. This affects settlements you have in the Empire. And what it effectively means is the more of the Empire's territory that is controlled by Imperial factions, the more benefits you get. You start at 66, that's where it starts. The higher it gets, the more benefits in terms of growth, control, income from buildings for regions in the Empire, crucially, only in the Empire, as well as mercenary replenishment time for Electric Count State Troopers. So State Troopers, they're specific units tied to certain Electric Count states. For Elspeth and Gelt, those troopers are unlocked with research. For Karl Franz, he doesn't have that research. Instead, the way he acquires these units is he needs to control the various provincial capitals of the Electric Counts directly in order to gain it. There's a lot of different dynamics in play here, but this is not really a video about Karl Franz. This is more of a general purpose video, though of course, I am using Karl Franz as the example right here. Now, one of the things that can be an issue in general in a campaign is Confederation. The best way to get the Confederation with the faction is to get good diplomatic relations with them and also be stronger than them while they are threatened. If they're not threatened, they will be far less willing to confederate. So over here, for instance, I've conquered Artois, I've dealt with Kamler, even Musalon. Lots of battles in that respect, but I've been building a diplomatic relationship with Marienburg, and now I declare war on Grom. The war in itself is not as relevant as a couple of other things. The military alliance, however, with Musalon, however, is. With Marienburg, however, is. Because by getting that kind of military alliance, I've put myself in a position where by declaring war on, say, the Fey Enchantress in that example, not necessarily the best for the record, But by declaring war on the Fey Enchantress, I've put myself in a very good position. And now I can just go and get all kinds of dealings with the territory that I've just acquired from Marienburg. And also, you know, obviously units, heroes, and all that kind of stuff. So, stuff to disband. Money, the way you gain money in a campaign, the best way really, is to sell territory you don't need to factions that have a lot of it. So, for a lot of money. So, for instance, Festus was at war with Talabayam. Talabayam was able to take her gig just before I confederated them using Karl's mechanic. But since Festus had a ton of money, I was able to do two things. One, I got him at war with both the Black Pit Tribe and the Barrel Legion, so he's actually going to leave me alone here for a while. Emphasis on for a while, he's not going to leave me alone permanently. But more importantly, I've gained a good amount of cash. This is why focusing on economic buildings early on in a campaign is kind of a waste of time, because the way you gain money is region trading, diplomacy, and even post-battle. You don't need to use region trading. You can just fight a lot of battles and provoke those fights and even ambush opponents to get that money. Various ways, various opportunities on that subject. So, for instance, right here, I'm just going to sell Musalon to Lyonesse and get a ton of money in the process right there. Bit of an issue with regards to the battle I will have right in that situation. Kamler is still alive, interestingly enough. Well, he kind of escaped with one army, I suppose. But yes, there are various opportunities that I do have right here in terms of various agreements I can reach. So, for instance, I can take Grungzint, and I can give that settlement to the dwarves, for instance, in exchange for a military alliance with said dwarves. And I can even give them this one settlement for them to declare war on Carcassonne. As an example, yes, we are wiping out the Fey Enchantress, no one really cares. We can get the peace agreement with her, but this is where I need to mention something important. It is tempting to view the Empire as the be-all and end-all of territory you need to focus on. But that's not necessarily correct either, because there are other territories in an Imperial campaign that are valuable. Yes, the Empire might suffer from decline in Imperial authority. You can always sort that out later. But Bretonnia in particular can be very useful, especially Bordalo, because you have this port and you have the orchards. So this is a good amount of growth, tradable resources, and if you're playing Karl, especially, that will help you out a great deal in a campaign in order to get things going. And if you're playing Elspeth, yes, you might focus on Vlad and so on and so forth, but again, you do have different things you care about during the course of a campaign. So for instance, over here, I've got a pretty sizable Imperial army right here under Marienburg, and more importantly than just that, I didn't just get Marienburg's main army. I could have conquered them, of course, but I've also gotten the Electrocount State Troopers right here, which I am losing a bit of money every turn, but that's, again, not really the most important thing to worry about during the course of your campaign. What is important about is to keep the momentum of a campaign going, keep the growth going. Sure, I haven't increased my battle mage capacity over here, though not really a big issue. I'm gonna deal with that in just a moment. In fact, I'm going to do it in Marienburg itself through the Wizard's Conclave, and just, you know, move my lords over here with Noble to just get that sorted very, very quickly right here. No problem whatsoever. So get mages, get units. Getting to tier 3, or especially tier 4, is a fairly substantial boost in your campaign. This is the reason I like Karl, because you can get to those higher tiers earlier. And he has a far more dynamic campaign in terms of the choices you have. Do you focus on the Empire? Do you focus on Bretonnia? Do you focus on Marienburg? You can pick a fight with Marienburg if you want to. And of course, you know, you get Gotrek and Felix, you get a bunch of heroes, a bunch of units. The army I have here is not especially strong, but then let's just say Gotrek and Felix do make it very strong. Empire being so large can be a major trap for players, especially if you're playing Karl Franz and say you confederate Talbaim with unification. And Talbaim is kind of the natural target for confederation, but it's not really worth it. I've learned that lesson plenty of times. So in terms of territory, the core regions of the empire that you do care about in the short term are Marienburg, Reichland, Nuln, and Saarland to a degree. If you're playing Karl Franz specifically, or Elspeth. Not so much if you're playing Gelt. These are the core Imperial regions, and kind of like your short-term objectives. Everything else is either mid-term or long-term. So things like Midland, Stirland, Talabaim, Averland, mid-term, and then Ostland, Ostermark, and Nordland as longer-term objectives. Sylvania is a bit up in the air with regards to this. On one hand, Sylvania is very rich. It gives you gold, it has wood, it has wine. So there's a ton of resources that you can get access to if you take Sylvania, and it is your natural expansion target as Elspeth. But keep in mind the issue with Vlad. It is a worthwhile idea if you're playing one of the major Imperial factions to get the other ones, or if you're Gelt to get both Elspeth and Gelt, to fight other major factions. So for instance, if you're playing, say, Karl, it's a great thing to try and organize a war between Elspeth and Vlad, because one, Elspeth is a very powerful faction, so is Karl, and they'll usually win. So get the other major Imperial faction, or both the major Imperial factions if you're playing Gelt, to find major enemies while you're expanding in other portions of the campaign map. Don't try and hold everything on your own, at least in a short campaign, because you'll end up spending a lot of resources. You can do it, but the problem is going to be the economic situation that you will be facing. Now, of course, the problem with the Empire is the way Imperial authority works, because usually when you go to war with Vlad, Zufbar is just going to be like, oh, free real estate, and then go take territory over here, which means that when you're playing an Imperial campaign, you may end up having to fight a war with dwarves in order to secure portions of Sylvania that they've taken. Suffice to say, that is not the best dynamic in the world to be dealing with. But yeah, just be aware that you don't want to ally Zufbar too quickly, because you may end up having to fight them. But Sylvania is a nice pocket province that you can take control over, and it's relatively secure, because even if Skarsnik or Azag win, they still have to get through Zufbar, provided you haven't destroyed them yourself, and you shouldn't destroy them. But also bear in mind, Zufbar might be wiped out by Vlad. That depends on the randomization of your campaign. But in essence, secure Sylvania while ignoring Averland. Averland is not really territory worth taking, and they're certainly not worth allying either, because they do have a tendency of declaring war on tons of factions. So don't ally them unless they're at war with someone. In this case, they're at war with the Changeling. So Averland's ridiculous AI aggression is aimed in this case by their war with the Changeling. So that's how I can trust them that they won't declare war on, say, Scrag or Gorbad, and then I have to deal with that. So it is that dynamic of dealing with territory, and also remember that you do need the entire empire under your direct control in order to get 100 Imperial authority. I wish it didn't work like this. If I feel it should work based on military alliances, especially with like Wood Elves or Kislev, but it is the dynamic we're dealing with. On top of that, unit-wise, what do you want to recruit? Well, that's the big question, isn't it? What you're really looking to recruit, and I'd recommend watching that video that I did, but in the short term, you're looking at spearmen with crossbowmen or handgunners or outriders, mortars, cannons, then great swords, Null iron sights, Hockland long rifles, some demigriffs if you want to, and then of course, land ships and cannons. Heroes are the core of what makes the Imperial faction work, though yeah, getting Fyodor Bruckner, it can be a bit annoying. You do need cavalry to do so, and you need a tier 3 cavalry building in order to get the quest, the first part of Bruckner's quest done, and the second part is killing 1,000 units with cav. You will have cavalry as the Empire, but rushing it just to get Bruckner can be a bit annoying. One of the most useful units in the Empire are the Eldred Guard, because the Empire struggles with having good line holders in much of their infantry, but Eldred's Guard have 80 armor, or a good amount of armor, and because of that armor, they're really, really good line holders. Of course, if you're playing Karl, you need to have control of Salland, so different dynamics, different problems. But of course, as Karl, you can kind of ignore the Empire for a while. Just make sure you support Midland, because Midland is the shield that guards Altdorf, Reichland. Basically, as long as Midland stands, very few factions can actually attack, or at least Festus, Norskins, Greenskins from the north can't attack Reichland directly, as long as Boris is still alive. If he falls, then that's a very different dynamic, but, you can always send aid or, money if you're playing as Elspeth, or just allow Karl to deal with that if you're Elspeth or Gelt. If you're playing Karl, sending aid, a couple of armies, taking territory and giving it back to Boris, just don't take the territory itself. It's expanding the border region that you then have to defend, and it takes a while for your economy to get going. You want to focus on growth and then economy, but that means you got to be careful and smart, or you fight a lot of battles and abuse various things in order to get it going. It depends on how you want to approach it from a cheese perspective, if you will. But yes, those are some of the factors that you should be aware of when you're playing an Imperial campaign. That's all I had to say. Questine signing out. Long-term objectives, like obviously gaining control of Talabayam for the Knights of the Blazing Sun, dealing with Festus, getting control of Midland. All of these things are very, very much worth it, but that depends on what your objective is. I'd say the longest term objective is 100 Imperial Authority, but don't sacrifice everything on the altar of Imperial Authority, because it's not necessarily going to be worth it. It's a nice benefit, but there's a lot of hoops you have to jump through in order to make it work in a campaign. That's all I had to say. Questine signing out.